Story 1. The Silent Echo. It was a crisp November evening at Jefferson High School, and Ms. Clara Bennett sat alone in her classroom, surrounded by a fortress of ungraded essays. The clock on the wall ticked past 7, its steady rhythm the only companion to the soft scratch of her pen. The school, a sprawling relic of brick and mortar built in the early 20th century, lay silent around her. Most teachers and students had long since gone home, leaving only the faint hum of flickering fluorescent lights and the occasional groan of the old building settling into the night. Ms. Bennett sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. She'd been teaching English at Jefferson for over 15 years, but tonight, the weight of those years felt heavier than usual. She decided to stretch her legs and grab a cup of coffee from the staff room. Locking her classroom door behind her, she stepped into the dimly lit hallway, her footsteps echoing off the chipped linoleum. As she passed the old girls' bathroom near the east wing, a sudden sharp bang reverberated through the corridor. Ms. Bennett froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was unmistakable, a stall door slamming shut with force. Heart pounding, she turned toward the source. The bathroom door stood there, its faded paint peeling, a rusty padlock securing it shut, and a weathered sign dangling crookedly that read, "Out of service." "That's impossible," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. The bathroom had been locked and abandoned for decades, since 1986 to be precise. Everyone at Jefferson knew why. Clara had been a sophomore at this very school when it happened. Her friend, Lily Grayson, had died in that bathroom. The official story was that Lily had locked herself in a stall and taken her own life, a tragedy that shook the small town to its core. The school board, unwilling to let the space become a grim shrine or fuel for teenage rumors, had sealed it off shortly after. Over time, the incident faded into whispered lore, but for Clara, the memory remained as vivid as ever. She edged closer to the door, her curiosity battling her rising unease. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" Silence answered her. She reached out and tugged at the padlock. It held firm, cold and unyielding under her fingers. Yet, as she stood there, a faint sound drifted through the door, a soft, pitiful sobbing, like that of a girl in distress. Clara's blood ran cold. She pressed her ear against the wood, straining to listen. The crying was real, faint but undeniable. Her mind raced. Could it be a student trapped inside? No, that didn't make sense. The door was locked tight, and no one had access, not even the janitors. "Mr. Dawson!" she called out, hoping the night janitor was nearby. Her voice echoed down the empty hall, unanswered. The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Clara stepped back, her breath shallow. She was about to turn away when something made her pause. The door creaked ever so slightly, as if nudged by an unseen hand. It didn't open, couldn't open, but the movement sent a shiver down her spine. She hurried back to her classroom, her mind churning. The rational part of her insisted it was nothing, a trick of the wind, a pipe rattling in the walls. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was more. She thought of Lily, her bright smile and quiet demeanor, and the guilt that had gnawed at Clara for decades. They'd been inseparable back then, sharing secrets and dreams over lunch in the cafeteria. But in the weeks before Lily's death, Clara had noticed her friend pulling away, darker circles under her eyes, forced smiles that didn't reach them. She'd asked if something was wrong, but Lily had brushed it off. And then, one rainy afternoon, she was gone. Clara sank into her chair, staring blankly at the essays. The memory of that day flooded back. The hushed whispers in the halls, the principal's somber announcement over the intercom, the way the bathroom door had been cordoned off with yellow tape. She'd never gone near it after that, not until tonight. A second bang jolted her from her reverie, louder this time, unmistakably from the bathroom. She stood, resolve hardening. She couldn't ignore it again. Grabbing her flashlight, she kept one in her desk for power outages. She marched back to the east wing. The door loomed ahead, still locked, still silent. She hesitated, then rapped her knuckles against it. "Lily?" she whispered, feeling foolish even as the name slipped out. A chill swept through the hall, and the lights overhead flickered. Then, from within, came a sound that turned her knees to jelly. A voice soft and broken, whispering, "Clara?" She stumbled back, the flashlight trembling in her grip. "No," she gasped. "This isn't happening." But it was. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. She shone the beam at the door, half expecting to see something, someone, standing there. The hallway remained empty, but the whispering grew louder, overlapping into a desperate plea. "Clara, help me." Tears stung her eyes. "Lily, is that you? What do you want?" The response came not in words, but in a vision. As if pulled into a memory, Clara saw the bathroom as it had been in 1986, brightly lit, bustling with girls fixing their hair before class. Then the scene shifted. Lily, alone, her face streaked with tears, slamming the stall door shut. But she wasn't alone for long. Shadows loomed outside the stall, girls, their voices sharp and mocking, pounding on the door, laughing as Lily begged them to stop. The lock clicked, trapping her inside, and then silence. Clara snapped back to the present, her chest heaving. "They locked you in," she whispered. "It wasn't suicide." The air pulsed with energy, and the voice spoke again, clearer now. "Tell them." She nodded, a fire igniting within her. "I will. I promise." The next morning, Clara couldn't teach. Her thoughts were consumed by what she'd seen. During her free period, she dug through the school archives, pulling dusty yearbooks and faded newspaper clippings. The articles called it a suicide, but the details were sparse. Then she found a note in the margins of an old student council log, a rumor about a group of seniors harassing a girl in the bathroom, dismissed as gossip. Clara tracked down old classmates, piecing together fragments of the truth. Lily had been targeted by a clique of girls, jealous of her quiet beauty and academic success. They'd tormented her for months, and that day in the bathroom, their prank had gone too far. Panicked by her distress, they'd fled, letting the lie of suicide take root. Armed with names and memories, Clara went to the police. It took weeks, but the investigation reopened the case. The women, now in their 50s, confessed under pressure. Lily's death was ruled an accidental manslaughter, and though the legal consequences were light after so many years, the town finally knew the truth. The disturbances in the bathroom stopped. One evening, as Clara graded papers in her classroom, she felt a gentle warmth, a whisper of "thank you" brushing her ear. She smiled, tears falling freely. Lily was at peace. And so, at last, was she. Story 2. The Whispering Pages. Mr. Jonathan Pierce sat hunched over a cluttered desk in the dimly lit staff room of St. Augustine Academy, surrounded by towering stacks of old yearbooks. The Academy, a prestigious institution founded in 1890, loomed with a rich and shadowy history, its stone walls whispering tales of the past. As the new history teacher, Jonathan had been tasked with updating the school's historical records, a job that ignited his curiosity about the Academy's forgotten stories. The musty scent of aged paper filled the air as he flipped through the 1985 yearbook, his fingers brushing against the faded photographs of students and faculty from decades ago. His gaze snagged on an unfamiliar face, a stern-looking woman with sharp, piercing eyes and a tight bun of dark hair. The caption beneath the photo read, "Ms. Beatrice Holloway, History Department." Jonathan frowned, puzzled. He'd memorized the faculty list before starting his job, and Ms. Holloway's name was nowhere to be found. It was as if she'd been scrubbed from the school's collective memory, a ghost lingering only in this single yellowed page. Intrigued, he decided to consult Mrs. Wilkins, the elderly librarian who had served at the Academy for over 40 years. She was a living archive, her mind a treasure trove of the school's lore. "Excuse me, Mrs. Wilkins," Jonathan began, holding up the yearbook. "Do you remember a Miss Beatrice Holloway? She taught history here in 1985. Mrs. Wilkins adjusted her glasses and leaned in to examine the photo, her brow furrowed, deepening the lines on her weathered face. Holloway? No, I don't recall that name. Are you sure she was here? Jonathan nodded, pointing to the caption. It's written right here. She studied the image again, her lips pursing in thought, then shook her head slowly. Strange. I don't remember her at all. Perhaps she was only here briefly, a fleeting shadow passing through. Unsatisfied, Jonathan sought out another veteran of the academy, Mr. Thompson, the janitor, who had been tending the school's halls since the 1970s. He was a gruff but warm man, always ready with a tale about creaky floors or flickering lights. When Jonathan asked about Ms. Holloway, Mr. Thompson scratched his head, his calloused fingers raking through thinning hair. Can't say I remember her. Must have been before my time, but I started in '78. Puzzled, Jonathan returned to the yearbook. There was something unnerving about Ms. Holloway's intense gaze, as if she were watching him from across the decades. Determined to unravel the mystery, he resolved to search the school's archives for more clues. As he navigated the echoing hallways, lined with rusted lockers and peeling posters, he spotted Emily, one of his students, lingering near the closed library. The library had been locked for weeks, its heavy oak doors sealed during renovations, and the area was strictly off-limits. "Emily, what are you doing here?" Jonathan asked, his tone gentle but firm. Emily jumped, her wide eyes darting to him. "Oh, Mr. Pierce, I thought I saw someone near the library." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "The library's closed. Who did you see?" She hesitated, twisting her fingers nervously. It was a woman. She was wearing old-fashioned clothes, like from the '80s. Long skirt, high collar. She walked right up to the library door and then disappeared. A cold shiver traced Jonathan's spine. "Disappeared? Are you sure?" Emily nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, I swear I saw her. She had dark hair and was carrying a stack of books." Trying to stay rational, Jonathan offered, "Maybe it was one of the construction workers." "But the library's locked, and the workers left hours ago," Emily countered, her certainty unshaken. Curiosity outweighing caution, Jonathan approached the library door. It was indeed locked, a faded sign reading, "Closed for renovations," dangling crookedly on the glass. He peered through the small window, but the interior was swallowed by shadows, the bookshelves mere silhouettes in the gloom. As he turned to leave, a faint sound stopped him cold, the soft rustle of pages turning. He froze, ears straining. The sound grew clearer, unmistakable, as if someone were flipping through a book just beyond the door. "Emily, do you hear that?" he whispered. Her eyes widened in fear. "Yes, it sounds like someone's inside, reading." Jonathan's pulse quickened. "But the library's empty. No one's been in there for weeks." The rustling intensified, joined by a faint whisper, like a voice reading in a hushed, mournful tone. Jonathan leaned closer, trying to decipher the words, but they slipped away like smoke. Then, abruptly, the sound ceased, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. "We should tell someone," Emily urged, her voice barely audible. Jonathan agreed, and they rushed to the principal's office. Principal Harris, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, listened with a skeptical frown. "It's an old building," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "Probably just the wind or pipes settling. Don't let your imaginations run wild." Unconvinced, Jonathan returned to the archives that evening, fueled by a growing obsession. He sifted through dusty boxes for hours until he unearthed a brittle newspaper clipping from 1985. The headline blared, "Tragic Accident at St. Augustine Academy." The article recounted how Ms. Beatrice Holloway, a history teacher, had led a field trip to a local historical site. A student, Sarah Thompson, had fallen from a cliff under her watch. Though cleared of blame, Ms. Holloway was shattered by guilt and resigned soon after, vanishing from the town. Jonathan's blood ran cold. Sarah Thompson. Could she be connected to Mr. Thompson, the janitor? The next day, he found Mr. Thompson sweeping the courtyard. "Sir, I read about a Ms. Holloway and an accident involving a student named Sarah Thompson. Was she your relative?" Mr. Thompson's broom stilled, his face draining of color. "Sarah was my daughter," he said hoarsely. "She died in that accident. Ms. Holloway was her teacher. After it happened, she blamed herself, even though it was ruled an accident. She left, and I never saw her again." Jonathan's mind whirled. "But her photo's in the 1985 yearbook, and Emily saw her near the library." Mr. Thompson's eyes widened. "Saw her? That's impossible. She's long gone." "Unless," Jonathan faltered, "unless it's her ghost." Mr. Thompson scoffed, but unease flickered in his gaze. "Ghosts? That's nonsense." Yet Jonathan couldn't dismiss it. That night he returned to the library, the hallway cloaked in stillness. As he neared the door, the pages began turning again, louder, insistent. Heart pounding, he called out, "Ms. Holloway, are you there?" The sound stopped, and a soft, anguished voice replied, "Yes." Jonathan's breath hitched. "Why are you here?" "I cannot leave," the voice whispered, "not until I make amends." Amends for what? For Sarah. It was my fault. I should have protected her. "It was an accident," Jonathan said, his voice softening. "You weren't to blame." "I failed her," she insisted, the words heavy with regret. "I failed as a teacher." The door creaked open a sliver, despite its lock, revealing a faint, translucent figure, a woman in a long dress, clutching books, her face etched with sorrow. "Ms. Holloway," Jonathan said gently, "you've punished yourself long enough. Sarah wouldn't want this. Forgive yourself." Tears shimmered in her ghostly eyes. "How can I?" "By helping others," he suggested. "Share your knowledge, guide the students from beyond." Her expression softened, a faint hope dawning. "Perhaps that's why I linger." In the weeks that followed, the library transformed. Books opened to key pages overnight, revealing historical insights. Students felt a comforting presence, their studies enriched by an unseen hand. Emily especially thrived, crediting a silent tutor for her success. Jonathan smiled, knowing Ms. Holloway had found peace as the Academy's eternal guardian, her whispers now a legacy of learning. Story 3. The Shadow by the Fence. At Maple Grove Elementary, a small school tucked away in a sleepy town surrounded by towering pines, the playground was a hub of energy and chatter most days. But every fall, when the air turned sharp and the leaves began to drift from the branches, something peculiar happened. The children, wide-eyed and restless, would start whispering about a figure they saw beyond the playground's chain-link fence. They called him the Shadow Man, a tall, silent presence cloaked in darkness, always watching. Ms. Clara Bennett, a pragmatic fourth-grade teacher who'd been at Maple Grove for 8 years, had grown accustomed to these tales. Each autumn, without fail, her students would bring up the Shadow Man. She'd chalked it up to childish imagination, a spooky story passed down like a playground tradition. This year, though, the whispers felt heavier, more persistent, and Miss Bennett found herself listening a little closer. It started on a brisk November afternoon. Recess was in full swing, the playground alive with the sounds of laughter and sneakers scuffing gravel. Miss Bennett stood by the slide, keeping an eye on her class, when she noticed a cluster of students near the edge of the play area, staring at the fence. She walked over, her boots crunching on the dry leaves scattered across the ground. "What's all this about?" she asked, her tone light but firm. Lucas, a wiry boy with a mop of brown hair, pointed toward the pines. "It's him, Ms. Bennett, the Shadow Man. He's back." Ms. Bennett squinted at the fence line. The trees cast long, jagged shadows in the fading daylight, but there was no one there, just the rusting metal links and the woods beyond. "I don't see anything, Lucas. Maybe it's just the wind moving the branches." "No," piped up Mia, a soft-spoken girl clutching her scarf. He's tall and he's got a long coat. He doesn't move. He just watches us." The other children nodded, their faces a mix of fear and excitement. Ms. Bennett forced a smile. "Well, there's nothing there now. Let's get back to playing before recess ends." As the group scattered, she cast one last glance at the fence. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw something, a flicker of movement among the trees, but she blinked, and it was gone. She shook her head, dismissing it as a trick of the light. Later, in the faculty room, Ms. Bennett sipped tea while flipping through a stack of worksheets. The door creaked open, and Mr. Thomas Reed, the school's gruff but kind-hearted janitor turned substitute, shuffled in with a mug of coffee. "You look distracted, Clara," he said, settling into a chair across from her. She sighed. "It's the kids. They're going on about that shadow man again. Every year, it's the same thing." Mr. Reed's bushy eyebrows lifted. "The shadow man, huh? That's been around longer than you have. I've heard kids talk about him for nigh on 15 years. Ms. Bennett paused, her cup halfway to her lips. 15 years? And they all say the same thing?" "Pretty much," he replied, leaning back. "Tall figure, dark coat, standing by the fence. Never says a word, just watches. Some of the older teachers used to joke it was a ghost, but who knows?" A chill crept up her spine, though she masked it with a chuckle. "Ghosts? Really, Thomas? Next you'll tell me the cafeteria's haunted, too." He grinned, but his eyes stayed serious. "Laugh if you want, but those kids see something. Always have." That conversation lingered in her mind. The next day, after the students had gone home, Ms. Bennett decided to investigate. The sky was a deep gray, heavy with the promise of rain, as she crossed the empty playground. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. She reached the fence and stood where the children had pointed, peering into the woods. The trees loomed tall and silent, their trunks swallowed by shadows. She saw nothing, no figure, no movement, just the stillness of the forest. Yet the hairs on her neck prickled, as if unseen eyes were fixed on her. A sudden rustle made her spin around, but it was only a squirrel darting across the leaves. "Get a grip, Clara," she muttered, turning to leave. Then she noticed it, a scrap of dark cloth caught on the fence, fluttering faintly in the breeze. It looked old, weathered, like part of a coat. She reached for it, but the wind snatched it away, sending it tumbling into the trees. Her pulse quickened. Coincidence, she told herself, but the unease stayed with her. The children's stories grew more vivid over the following week. They said the shadow man was closer now, standing right at the fence instead of beyond it. Their drawings, crude sketches of a looming figure in black, began piling up on her desk. Miss Bennett tried to calm them, but her own certainty was fraying. One evening, as she tidied her classroom, Mr. Reed stopped by with a dusty cardboard box. "Found this in the storage room," he said, setting it down. "Old records from when the school opened. Thought you might find it interesting." Curious, she sifted through the contents, yellowed papers, faded photos, until she stopped at a grainy black and white image. It showed the original Maple Grove staff from 1923. Among them stood a tall man in a long, dark coat, his expression cold and unreadable. "Who's this?" she asked, holding up the photo. Mr. Reed squinted at it. "That'd be Mr. Nathaniel Crow, the first custodian. Stern fella from what I've heard. Kept the kids in line, always watching over the grounds. Died in a storm one November, right near the playground, if the stories are true." Ms. Bennett's stomach tightened. "November? That's when the kids start seeing him." He shrugged. "Could be a coincidence. Could be more. Up to you what you make of it." Sleep eluded her that night. The photo of Mr. Crow burned in her memory, his height, his coat, the way he seemed to stare through the lens. Was it possible the children were glimpsing something tied to the school's past? Determined to settle her doubts, she returned to the playground the next evening. The sun had just set, leaving the sky a bruised purple. She stood by the fence, the cold seeping through her jacket, and waited. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the faint scent of decay. Time stretched on, and she began to feel foolish. She turned to go, then froze. A low murmur, like distant voices, drifted from the woods. Slowly she faced the fence again. There he was, a towering silhouette in a dark coat, standing mere feet away, his features lost to shadow. Her breath hitched. "What do you want?" she called, her voice shaking. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It raised a hand, palm up, as if beckoning her closer. Then, in an instant, it stepped back and melted into the darkness, leaving only the swaying trees behind. Ms. Bennett stumbled away, her heart pounding. She never spoke of that night to her students, but she stopped brushing off their tails. The shadow man of Maple Grove Elementary remained an enigma, a presence hovering between truth and fantasy, watching from the edge of the world. Story 4. The Vanished Girl. It was a chilly fall day, and the last rays of sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of the old classroom at Oakwood School. Mr. James Anderson, the new history teacher, was still adjusting to the creaky wooden floors and battered desks that seemed to carry the weight of decades. The school, built in the previous century, was steeped in history, but that day there was something more lingering in the air than just the scent of old textbooks. Mr. Anderson was working on his lesson plan when his eyes happened to glance at the back corner of the classroom. There, a girl was sitting. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her pale face was striking in the dim light. She was dressed in a faded blue dress that seemed out of time, not like anything modern students would wear. The teacher frowned. He didn't recall seeing this girl in his class before. "Excuse me," he said, lifting his eyes from his papers. "Are you sure you're in the correct classroom? I don't have you on my roster." The girl didn't respond. She simply stared at him with a blank, distant look. Before he could say anything else, the bell rang and the students started packing up. The classroom filled with the sounds of chatter and shuffling feet. Mr. Anderson blinked and glanced back at the corner. The girl was gone. He looked around, puzzled. Could she have left that fast? He decided to double-check the roster, but deep inside, he sensed something was amiss. Later that day, while locking up his classroom, he bumped into Mr. Henry Wilkins, the school custodian. Henry was a veteran of the school, having worked at Oakwood for more than 30 years. His weathered face and silver hair hinted at the wealth of experiences he'd had, and his tales of the school's history were nearly legendary among the students. "Henry," Mr. Anderson started, "there was an odd girl in my classroom today. She wasn't on the roster and then she vanished. Do you know anything about this?" The custodian paused, resting on his broom. His eyes narrowed, as if trying to jog his memory. "A girl, huh? What did she look like?" "Long, dark hair, pale complexion, wearing a blue dress. It looked somewhat outdated." Henry's face turned a shade paler, though it was difficult to tell in the hallway's low light. He leaned in and whispered, "Sounds like Emily Carter." "Emily Carter?" the teacher inquired. "Who's that?" Henry sighed, as though he didn't want to revisit the past, but went on. "Emily was a student here in the 90s. She was quiet, a bit of a loner. Then one day she vanished. It was in October, I believe, during a rainy spell. There was a big search. Police, parents, the entire school was turned upside down, but she was never found. Some thought she ran away, others feared something more sinister. It was never solved." A shiver crept down Mr. Anderson's back. He attempted a smile, but it felt strained. "Do you think I saw her ghost?" Henry shrugged, though a flicker of concern crossed his eyes. "I'm not one to believe in ghosts, James. But over the years, I've heard tales. Students, teachers. Some claim to have seen a girl resembling Emily, always in the back of the classroom, always vanishing in the blink of an eye." Mr. Anderson returned home with a sense of unease. Henry's words reverberated in his thoughts. Ghosts? It sounded ridiculous, yet he couldn't dismiss the idea that he'd witnessed something beyond explanation. The following day, Mr. Anderson resolved to learn more. He visited the school library and dug up old yearbooks. In the 1992 volume, He found her picture. Emily Carter gazed at him from the faded page, the same long, dark hair, the same pallid expression. It felt as though her eyes were following him across the years. He pressed on, combing through archives of local newspapers. The articles described how Emily was last spotted walking away from the school in the rain. The search efforts spanned weeks, but no clues were found. The case was eventually closed, leaving only whispers and theories in its wake. Weeks went by, but the sensation of being observed lingered with Mr. Anderson. He started noticing odd details, murmurs in deserted corridors, fleeting shadows by the windows, chilly breezes despite all windows being closed. And then he saw her once more. It occurred one evening as he stayed behind in the classroom, marking assignments. A faint rustling sound made him turn. There she was, standing by the door, wearing the same blue dress, her hair gently moving as if stirred by an invisible breeze. Her eyes were deep and almost mournful. "Emily," he whispered, his voice shaking. She didn't respond. Slowly, she turned and left the room. Mr. Anderson hurried after her, but the corridor was deserted. There was only silence and the sound of his own footsteps. That night, sleep eluded him. If this was indeed Emily's spirit, why was she showing herself to him? Was there a message she wanted to convey? Did she require assistance? The following day, he chose to go to the location where Emily was last spotted, a small park adjacent to the school. It was now overrun with weeds and appeared neglected. As he stood there, a peculiar serenity washed over him. Maybe Emily's ghost was tethered to this spot, unable to move on. He shut his eyes and murmured quietly, "I will discover what befell you, Emily. I will help you rest in peace." When he opened his eyes, he saw an indistinct shape in the distance. It was her, but her expression appeared gentler, almost appreciative. Then she faded away into nothingness. After that incident, the sightings ceased. The classroom seemed cozier, the shadows less ominous. Mr. Anderson never encountered Emily again, but he had a sense that he had somehow aided her. Years went by, and Emily Carter's tale became a legend at Oakwood School. It was shared in hushed tones during recess, passed down through generations of students. Mr. Anderson, while he never forgot that experience, carried on with a quiet sense of fulfillment, knowing he had delved into the enigma of the missing student and possibly provided her with the closure she needed. Story 5. Shadows of the Stacks. It was a crisp autumn night, and Ms. Emily Carter, a devoted English teacher at Oakwood High School, lingered in the school library well past regular hours. The clock on the wall ticked toward 10, its hands casting long shadows across the room as she graded essays and planned lessons. The library was her haven, a grand old space with towering bookshelves that stretched into the gloom, their wooden frames polished to a gleam. The air carried the musty scent of aging paper, and faint beams of light filtered through stained glass windows, painting the floor in hues of red and gold. But tonight, the stillness felt alive, unsettled. As Miss Carter scribbled a note on a student's paper, a soft sound brushed against her ears, a whisper, faint as a breeze rustling leaves. She paused, pen hovering, and tilted her head. It was nothing, she told herself, just the creaks of an ancient building or the wind rattling the panes. Yet the whispers grew, weaving through the silence, insistent and layered, as if multiple voices overlapped in a hushed chorus. Her pulse quickened. Setting her work aside, she rose and followed the sound, her footsteps tapping lightly on the hardwood floor. The library unfolded like a labyrinth, its aisles brimming with knowledge from every era. The whispers beckoned her deeper, past rows of novels and science texts, until she reached the history section. Here the shelves sagged under the weight of leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked and faded. The air thickened with dust, and the voices swelled, urgent now, tugging at her curiosity. Reaching out, Miss Carter slid a book from the shelf. Its cover was worn, the title illegible. Inside, Elegant cursive sprawled across the flyleaf. Clara Henshaw, 1892. Her breath caught. Flipping through the brittle pages, she found a passage underlined in faded ink. History remembers those who speak, but what of those who whisper? The words sent a shiver down her spine. She grabbed another book, James Carver, 1895, and found another underlined line. The truth waits in the stillness. A third, Lillian Brooks, 1900, bore. Look where shadows linger. Each name, each message, felt like a plea from the past, etched into the library's bones. Her hands trembled as she replaced the books. The whispers surrounded her now, a cocoon of sound that pulsed with intent. She decided it was time to leave. Gathering her papers and coat, she hurried toward the exit, but the voices trailed her, softer yet persistent. Stepping into the chilly night, she glanced back at the library's dark windows. For a moment, a silhouette seemed to flicker in the glass, a figure watching. But when she blinked, it vanished. The whispers clung to her thoughts, an unshakable echo that left her certain she wasn't alone. The next morning, Miss Carter couldn't shake the experience. Over coffee in the teacher's lounge, she recalled a conversation with one of her students, Sarah Mitchell, from earlier that week. Sarah, a bright junior working on a history project, had chattered excitedly about the school's past. The library used to belong to the Henshaw family, she'd said, her eyes wide. They were rich, but people say they had secrets, dark ones. Some think the place is haunted. Miss Carter had chuckled then, dismissing it as teenage fancy. Now Clara Henshaw's name burned in her memory, and doubt crept in. Seeking answers, she visited Mrs. Agnes Porter, the school librarian, whose office was a cluttered nook of books and files. Mrs. Porter, a spry woman with silver hair, beamed at the chance to share her knowledge. "Oh, the library's got quite a tale," she said, leaning forward. "It was the Henshaw family's private collection back in the day, donated to the school around 1910. They were a big name in town, but rumors swirled about shady dealings. Clara, the youngest daughter, loved this place. Folks say she vanished one night. No trace, no explanation. Some blamed her father, Elias Henshaw, a stern man with a temper." Ms. Carter frowned. "Do you believe the ghost stories?" Mrs. Porter shrugged. "I'm not one for spirits, but this library's got a presence. History lingers here, doesn't it?" That afternoon, Ms. Carter confided in Mr. Daniel Reed, a history teacher and friend. Over sandwiches in the cafeteria, she recounted her night. The whispers, the books, the eerie sensation. Mr. Reed arched a brow. "Voices in the stacks? Sounds like a tale for Halloween. But I'll bite. Let's check it out after classes. I'm curious about this Henshaw business myself." Dusk settled as they returned to the library. The silence was heavy at first, but as they ventured into the history section, the whispers stirred anew. Mr. Reed froze. "I hear it," he whispered, his skepticism fading. Together they scoured the shelves, uncovering more books with names. Edward Miles, 1898, Rose Dalton, 1902, each with cryptic underlined passages. A pattern emerged. These were people tied to the town's past, many lost to time or tragedy. As they searched, Miss Carter's fingers brushed a loose panel in a bookshelf. It shifted, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a small, leather-bound journal, its edges frayed. The title page read, "The Diary of Clara Henshaw, 1892. Her heart raced as she opened it. Clara's entries painted a vivid picture, a young woman stifled by her family's rules, secretly meeting a stable hand named Peter, dreaming of freedom. But the tone darkened. "Father knows about Peter," one entry read. "He's furious, I'm afraid." The final words chilled her. "He's planning something awful. I'll run tonight. If I don't write again, I tried." Mr. Reed's face was grim. Elias Henshaw might have silenced her, and others too. These names, these messages, they're crying out to be remembered. The realization struck Ms. Carter like a wave. The whispers weren't just echoes, they were pleas. She and Mr. Reed resolved to act. They organized a remembrance ceremony in the library, inviting students and staff. On a quiet Friday evening, the room glowed with candlelight as Ms. Carter spoke. "History isn't just battles and dates," she said, her voice steady. "It's people. Clara, Peter, all those forgotten. They deserve to be heard." As she named them, reading their underlined words aloud, the air warmed. The whispers softened, then stilled. When the last candle flickered out, the library felt lighter, its silence no longer oppressive, but serene. Ms. Carter smiled, knowing she'd given the past a voice, and perhaps at last some peace.